I suppose when giving a presentation on the American Revolution, it's best to start with our culture's preeminent touchstone for the war, which is, of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Broadway musical smash hit, Hamilton. It shouldn't surprise you to know that the show, obviously a tremendous feat of song, dance, and storytelling in its own right, is good but not great when it comes to its ability to reproduce the events of the war faithfully. Foremost amongst its oversights, in my opinion, is the omission of the war's non-Anglo-American troops, including 30,000 German-speaking mercenaries who, at their height, comprised 40% of the British force in America. Commissioned by George III in the early months of 1776, these figures became just the latest manifestation of a long-standing pact between the Hanoverian dynasty in England and their German allies against the Catholic powers in Europe, foremost France and Spain. One which had often devolved into large-scale war in the 18th century. These men and their entourages hailed from many principalities throughout Germany, or what's now called Germany. They arrived in North America under the auspices, though, of 6 German city-states and took on the moniker common to the 2 largest, that being Hessia. The Hessians were remarkable figures in a late 18th century world dominated by imperial action, and more to our purposes in the history of the South. Caught up in a world of empires and colonies, one in which nearly all of their contemporaries were engaged in systems of exploitation, either from above or below, the Hessians remained largely other, extra-imperial, and to a point, outside observers. To be sure, they were routinely made operatives of the British Empire and remunerated for their services. However, close readings of their surviving diaries reveal a somewhat surprising epistemic distance from their redcoat allies and a willingness to challenge ideological differences as they pertained to questions of race and national identity foremost. I shouldn't overstate this fact, though. These men found themselves in a ruptured yet still British North America on imperial business, and by and large held concurrent beliefs on matters of allegiance and duty. Having introduced my Hessian subjects then, I'd like to examine one instant of their wartime odyssey, rife with questions of self-creation, self-definition, and self-performance. Questions which, I might add, have once again become relevant in our present postmodern moment. We live, as many have noted, in a me generation, and unpacking that constructed self-referent is imperative to making sense of our own lived experiences and charting a path forward. Let's begin in the last weeks of winter 1777, with British forces in North America still reeling from the German mercenaries' stunning surrender at Trenton in December of the prior year, one which by all accounts rescued the rebel cause from the grips of certain defeat. Another Hessian company was readying itself for its own transatlantic voyage. Having marched more than 60 kilometers from their mustering point in the city of Ansbach, the regiment Voigt von Salzburg arrived in the neighboring city of Oxenfurt on the evening of March 9th. Exhausted by days of arduous travel from their home principality, the regiment was corralled onto several seafaring boats in anticipation of an immediate departure for the American continent via Nijmegen in Holland. Finding their path out of Oxenfurt blocked until the next day, the men were forced to remain on board the vessels overnight, standing shoulder to shoulder without enough space to lie down. Mutiny came with the dawn. Humiliated by poor treatment at the hands of their superiors, several hundred men broke rank and fled their boats, making their way into the city, where they were confronted by men of their own company charged with suppressing pockets of defiance. Eyewitness accounts describe a full-scale revolt in which the ensuing skirmishes produced at least 30 casualties and 25 desertions. The uproar lasted the entire day until order was restored by an unlikely source. Having rowed through the night, Karl Alexander, Margravit of Ansbach-Beirut, the principality where these men were from, arrived early on the morning of March 11th to a scene of death and disorder. Taking a conversational approach to his diplomacy, the German prince began inquiring into many reported grievances of his men, responding to their individual complaints with an unexpectedly open mind. To those fearful of losing contact with their loved ones, for instance, he promised access to a personal postal service. To repentant mutineers, he went beyond usual measures by guaranteeing gifts of grain and debt relief to them and their families. He augmented rations and salaries, and most importantly, procured 2 additional boats to ensure comfortable travel for his troops to Namibia. Multiple sources record these discussions as having occurred mano a mano, with the Margrave's promised compensation being as unique as the men he encountered in Oxenford. After days of discourse, Carl Alexander took one additional exceptional step. He boarded the river boats and journeyed with his regiment to Holland before they departed for New York, where, as British officials reported, they arrived in perfect good order. What then can be gleaned from this peculiar mutiny at Oxenford and its remarkable resolution under the leadership of Carl Alexander with regards to the Hessian self? Firstly, there's the matter of the self as a locally produced entity. In the tradition of post-Enlightenment expressivism, which philosopher Charles Taylor details in his book Sources of the Self, it's become commonplace today to understand the self as an internal reality existing at a sort of theoretical center of our being. The Hessians at Oxenford, however, remind us that the self can never be completely detached from its surrounding environment, and that our movements and positionality in and through the world inform a great deal of who we perceive ourselves to be. I would argue that this is especially an important takeaway for our modern age of the Anthropocene, where our relationship to our environment, both in a global context and in a local one, is constantly coming into present conversations and is in dire need of a rethinking at the very least, if not complete reform. This, I should add, can be seen not only in the insubordination of those confined to the cramped quarters after long days of marching, but also, and I would argue even more so, in the intervention of Carl Alexander. In him, we find a Margrave compelled beyond his domain into a neighboring principality to settle a highly volatile situation. Leaving his own seat of power behind, the nobleman nevertheless carried some of his authority with him to Oxenford, and yet here, embroiled in unforeseen circumstances, is forced to perform himself in an unorthodox fashion as a layman's interlocutor. The primal role which one's environment plays then in constituting their notions of selfhood and identity should not be discounted in either our historical or our present-day context. With that said, let us further consider just what it was that drew the Margrave to Oxenford and what he encountered there. At first, it appears to have been nothing more than a mass mutiny typologically similar to the war the Hessians were sailing off to fight in. But this misses in my opinion, this misses the trees for the forest. I would argue that at Oxenford, we encounter Hessians that have effectively telescoped our modern notion of a bifurcation between the individual and the collective. Here, the self manages to trade the two ideas and use this plasticity to its advantage. Start with the concept of the Hessian self operating as an individual. I enlist, I march, I'm exhausted, I'm outraged. Alone, I am limited in my ability to alter my present situation. However, coming in contact with many other like selves on this proverbial, you might even say nautical meeting ground, the Hessian soldier is able to tap into his power within a broader collective, which though we might analytically think of as distinct from the individual, is really nothing more than an ulterior form of the self. It is this collective which has the gravity for the Hessian soldier to draw Carl Alexander into his orbit. Upon his arrival, the Margrave cannot negotiate with an anonymous mass, and thus he must discourse with individuals once again. The individual animates the collective, which in turn animates the individual. Put another way, the collective has individual grievances, the individual has collective ones. Even this characterization is ultimately lacking conceptually because the two are not really so distinct. Instead, they appear as dual modes within which the Hessian mercenary, a modern forerunner with its remarkable extra-imperial qualities, can operate simultaneously and harmoniously. The real diplomatic skill displayed by Carl Alexander comes not from his willingness to dialogue with his troops, but the recorded ease with which he engaged both spaces of the Hessian self at once, so as to diffuse their unique qualms. Here's hoping that we, as academics, might be able to do so in our own domains moving forward. I'll leave things there for the moment and would happily answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.